My name is Carl Kriesman. Pleasure to be here with you. I am a professor of history at Valencia College, and it's been my pleasure to work with the library since 2017. And we run two series that next year, in the semi-quincentennial, we're going to basically just merge together and do an entire year focused on the 250th anniversary of events from 1776. So I'm very, very excited about that. But it's been a great pleasure to spend time here with the library and kind of examining both events from history that are sporadic and random. So this year we've done the Battle of Waterloo, and we looked at imperialism. Both of those were connected to the year of Jane Austen that the library is engaged with. And then alternate months are what we call citizen civics, which is really what this month is about, and which we try to look at aspects of our civic structure. What does it mean to be in our civic structure? What did the founders attempt to design? What were they trying to build? And to some degree, just let the lessons of history guide each of us as citizens as to how we feel like it should then look, or what we do with it in today's concept. I think I've always tried to stress that our founders themselves, though they were very, very well aware of the fact that they were doing something both unique and special and would be, in their opinion, studied through history. They were quite conscious of all the things they were writing. They typically were not writing just because. They were writing with a view of people in the future will read this. At the same time, I think it's fair that I think all of them, some perhaps more than others, were quite aware that future citizens will take matters into their own hands, and I think they would say, and well, they should. So, that's kind of the idea of what we're trying to do with Citizen Civics. It connects to what I've been doing this year specifically in both series that weren't, necessarily connected to something else, because we did have some other sessions this past series, which is to tie this work into my doctoral research, because it's connected to that idea that there are lessons for us from history relative to the structure that we have, and it is connected to my contention that, and this is something that I've been harping on, talking about, researching on, writing on for going on 20 years, in which there's something that is, in my opinion, gone wrong with our story, or we have gone off course. Or the more simple metaphor that I've used is, you think about a recipe, what's coming out of the kitchen no longer tastes right, and we're like, this doesn't taste like I remember it tasting, and so maybe we need to review the recipe. And so in that contention, my viewpoint and the hypothesis behind the research was that we need to do a better job of anchoring ourselves into our history, so that we can have an understanding of what the documents tell us about the structure of this thing we call the United States. And one of the core things that we've talked about, and it'll become very important for this lecture today, is that for the founders, they saw their structure demands a common moral virtue foundation. Common perhaps being the most important word when you look at the times of stress and tension that our nation has gone through. And as I've said before, division and stress and tension are not unique to this time that we live in today. This is part of a longer pattern which you could study, which is a different conversation. But nonetheless, the idea of things being held in common, at least at a moral virtue foundational level, becomes a key aspect. So for me then, that raised the specter, which was a key part of the research, that our discussion, were we to wish to fix things, and by the way, that's really the leading question that a person should ask themselves, is, do I indeed want to preserve the civic system that was first entrusted to us in the founding moment? One of us is allowed to say, no, I don't want that anymore. We're allowed to, as citizens, to say, I wish for something different. And there's been many iterations of things over the past 250 years or 49 years from 1776. And you, like anybody else, can study those, read those, and then perceive it to be perhaps an improvement or better. I, cards on the table, like our system and wish to preserve it. Hence my efforts to say to the citizenry and my neighbors, we can do better, and we need to find for ourselves a path to help us in this way. At that core, though, is if there is this idea from the founders that there is a common moral virtue foundation, that without that foundation, then the only way the system can work, according to the founders, is through force. And the simple illustration I've given before is that we stop at stop signs without police officers on every corner, not because we're afraid of the insurance and not because we're afraid of a ticket, but because we love our neighbor. So I have a moral virtue foundation that says to me, I care for my neighbor's dog, my neighbor's possessions, my neighbor's identity. And so I'm going to stop even at 2 a.m. and just make sure nobody's here. Without that moral virtue foundation, then the only reason I would stop is out of fear from the central government, showing up in the expression of the police force. The police are merely an expression of the power of the government. That's their role to play. And so the founders were like, we don't want that. And you saw that in the first government, which we're going to kind of dig into. So what we've done so far here at the library, now again, if you go to this link, you can find all of the podcasts. So the doctorate I wrote, I didn't have to write a dissertation. I actually was quite sad about that. I like to write. So I was sad and I wanted to write. But long story short is we did it in a 12 episode with 4 bonus episodes, so 16 episode podcast. You can find the links there. For the Google YouTube version, my website will come at the very, very end if you say, well, I listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or something, so it'll be up later. But here, we've looked at parts of that research, and we've done it so far in 4 sessions. In January, we talked about the unique construction, back to the first point of like, is it worth preserving? You don't have to agree with me. I think it is. Then what were the underlying philosophical foundations, looking at the role the Enlightenment played at that time period, which was really crucial for many of our founders. And then we said, well, then what happened with first colonies? Because again, if we're thinking again of the metaphor of like a recipe, well, the first cooks in the kitchen were the first colonists. So what lessons did they give us? We looked at a lot of key things from them. And then we went to 1776 to look at the writings and the documents. And again, all those lectures are also on here from those sessions. You're like, oh, I missed it. Well, go to here, the YouTube channel. What did we see? Well, in 76, as we know, critical decisions were made, leading ultimately to the one that said we will break from our parent country, from our parent government. And so that decision led them to create 3 committees to get to work on structuring what that should look like. One of those is the most famous. It's the one Adams and Jefferson and Franklin were on to create a declaration. One of those, though, was to create a governing system, which they did, called the Articles of Confederation. And then the third one was designed to create the beginnings of our diplomatic identity. That's the short answer. What they called it, the Model Treaty. All right? So they did that work, and they completed it quite successfully. As you know, July 2nd, they approved the Declaration of Independence. Then they spent 2 days or day and a half editing it with the final perfunctory vote on the 4th, which is what we celebrate today, much to the chagrin of people like John Adams. And then later, they completed in a debate in August the initial design for our first government. One of the things I stress again and again and again, and it's vital for you to get where I'm going in today's lecture, the U.S. Constitution is our second government. So that should raise immense questions in our minds. And by the way, it underscores what I said previously, that our founders would be not heartbroken if we just threw the whole thing out and wrote a third government. So a second government. And we'll note, they chose not to amend the first government, but to just ditch it. So it's not like if we did that, we would be somehow creating a new precedent. We could just do what they did, which is decide, yep, that one's no good anymore, I want to do a new one. And we could, but that's what they do. But you have to understand the Constitution in its context of this specific and intentional change from their first government. Their first government, you'll read online, it was a terrible government. It wasn't. You'll read online that it was a poorly constructed government. It wasn't. You'll read online that it was done in a rushed concept. It wasn't. It was a thoughtful, organized, planned government that was designed to meet their philosophical viewpoints in 1776. So then the question you and I have is, well, how do we get to 1787, which is what we're going to do, kind of working our way through. Now, we spent a lot of time in the last session, so go find the July lecture, walking through what they were debating and how they did debate. We're not going to cover that ground. I'm just going to say simply that the government was intentional. It believed in checks and balances, but it believed in checks and balances between the federal and the state. I always have to pause here to make sure you're understanding the words I use. When we use the word nation, it is merely a synonym for all the other words to describe a large-scale civic government. Yes, there's difference in the detail, but at the general level, nation, state, empire, tribe, kingdom, dukedom, whatever other word you want to use that describes a civic entity, and a civic entity is a specific place under a specific set of rules in a specific geographical constraints in which the people who live here know they're part of it, and they know who's not part of it. And so, at the time of our founding, you and I here, 250 years later, state as merely a small part of a larger whole. It's subordinate in our minds to nation, not equivalent. But to them, state is equivalent to nation. So they were trying to balance the independence or the power of 13 nations that had agreed to conglomerate into one other entity, not a different entity, but another entity. So that they would have said, well, I'm a citizen of South Carolina and a citizen of the United States. Now, some of you may say that if you're traveling abroad, I'm a citizen of Florida. Most of us would just say, I'm a citizen of the United States. So that's the change that's occurred. I'm not saying it's good or bad. We just need to understand how they perceived it. And so they wanted to construct something that did allow for that identity, that viewpoint of, well, we are a collective something, and at the same time maintain my national identity as a Pennsylvanian or as a Massachusetts person. All right? And if you know anything of our history and you think immediately to the Civil War and states' rights, good for you, because you're already tracking how we get to there, which is not our conversation today, but you have to see it, not trying to absolve anybody of anything or declare somebody good and somebody bad in that conversation, but just you have to understand like how they were working their way through and what they were thinking about it. And you'll see this is not a detriment, this is a feature. It was a designed feature. Again, you'll find online people saying, oh, the Articles was a terrible design or a terrible plan because they gave no power to the federal government. And as much as I don't think this is a workable government for a nation, Carl doesn't, they perceive that as an intentional feature. It's a bonus. If you put it on the end of the back of the box, when we used to get software in boxes, and you have the little bullet point that would say, we're doing this and this and this. Isn't that awesome? You should buy this. You should buy our product. That's what the Americans would have said. Limited federal government and the balance of power between the federal and the state, with the state being dominant. So, how did it work? Not very good. Not very good at all. You can see this in one of the most simple things. They rarely had a quorum. Now, some of you may not have any background at all with kind of how rules of organizing groups work. Some of you may be in HOAs, and some of you may know groups that have used Robert's Rules of Order and all that kind of stuff. But in general, if you're in a system that's going to have some sort of a design process about agreeing on decisions and voting or concluding things, often that system will have a thing called a quorum, meaning how many people are necessary before what we want to do is actually legit. If we need 10 homeowners of the HOA and only 5 come, no matter how much we want to pass a rule saying you can't paint your house red, you can't because you only had 5 people there and you needed a quorum of 10. I'm sure that makes sense for everybody. So you can automatically see part of the challenge because the states and the state elected officials obviously did not deem it important to go. In contrast, once we have our first Congress under the Constitution, they never have quorum issues. They do have some times when members aren't there, but they never have quorum issues. So you can see the mentality kind of working their way in. And it's interesting, you can see they start begging. They're going, please make sure you have somebody there. Please, pretty please. And you can see this also in how they wrote any decisions that they make. There's almost a pleading or a plaintive tone coming from the Congress, where they're going, we have earnestly recommended, and we indispensably find it necessary, and we recommend to. So there's like, we're passing a rule that we know has no strength. Again, it's meant to have no strength because it's a weak federal system. It's weak for the federal government. But this is how you get people who begin to start saying, not sure this is working out the way you thought it was going to work out. Which, by the way, if you do examine some of the decisions made by the Confederate States of America, particularly 61 to 63, when they still had some viability as an entity, they had the exact same problems. So if you are someone who wants to try a new system, don't try this system. Because this system doesn't work. Because there's just too many flaws about, to say I'm both a citizen of Florida and an equal citizen of the group, it just doesn't work. Or at least we were never able to figure out a way to make it work. They have financial issues. This is often held up as perhaps the number one crisis, is they didn't have a way to directly tax. Taxes were construed and then requested, again, please, pretty please, to the states. Here's how much you're supposed to pay. And they didn't. Repeatedly, they didn't, which you can see that in the whole time, only 1.5 million out of 10 million was requested. Complain about the IRS all you want. At least we get most, I won't say we get all, most of our money. Of course, you and I probably, that's because it's taken from us electronically and nobody's asking you and me to write that check, because I don't know about you, but I might be a little slow on writing that check. But nonetheless, we get our money through our system we have now. They did not then, because it was requested from whom? Their equal partner, these 13 equal entities. It's sort of like, hey, you said you would, which, by the way, kind of links us to, philosophically, you need to see the Articles as a John Locke document. Because the principal concept of John Locke is that the human is good and will do what is right for the system. And this is why, when you get to Washington's administration, he and Jefferson will ultimately go to their graves hating each other, because Jefferson remains a lifelong lock-in till perhaps the very end of his life. And Washington never was a lock-in. And you can almost hear Washington saying to Jefferson a version of, hey, Tom, your ideas are nice, but I was there at Valley Forge when no nearby citizen would give us food. So I don't think that's the way to go. All right, so there's this idea of the lock-in concept. They also have bankruptcy threats. And you get this mostly when you read the letters and the writings of John Adams and Jefferson, who are two diplomats abroad. And they are seeing the reality of the fact that we have, there's very little respect for the country because we owe a lot of money, and it doesn't seem like we're able to generate any money. So then the creditors, these other nations, are kind of thinking, we ain't never getting paid back, are we? And so that's kind of causing problems when Adams and Jefferson would be trying to talk to their other nations that they were trying to reach out to. And you notice they thought about trying to pass an amendment, and then they just gave up. They decided, yeah, it's kind of a waste of time. Why? Because they don't think anybody will care. So again, that's telling. Now, don't hear them and say they're true. That's true. I think that is fair. The people on the other side, the leaders of, say, Georgia or the leaders of North Carolina would say, oh, we care. We care about our nation. My nation is North Carolina. That's what I care about. I'll give secondary thoughts to this other collection we've agreed to be a part of. So again, I want you to hold that tension and sort of see that pressure that's kind of building there. They do have the one success, which I'm sure you're familiar with. If you were here last year when I did a talk about the new abolition movement and specifically its connection to Ohio, and went really into depth on this, I'm going to kind of move quickly here. But they had these other lands to the west of where they had established themselves, And after some wrangling, they begin the process of figuring out how we're going to deal with those lands. And by the time they begin that, both Tennessee and Kentucky, Tennessee is an extension largely of the Carolinas, North Carolina maybe more specifically, and Kentucky as an extension of Virginia. It wasn't really, Kentucky was just named like Orange County, Osceola County. Kentucky was seen as that part of Virginia. They already had enough people that they were already making their moves to be in territories. The lower part of those lands were still peopled vastly by the native tribes that were there. So really their work in Congress was with that north upper part, which they called the West, and eventually we realized it's really in the middle, and so we call it the Midwest. But if you're ever wondering, Ohio, it's not west, it's west of Pennsylvania, that's the best you got. But it's west because of that tradition back to it. That was seen as the far west. So they begin kind of figuring out how to do that. They do it through 3 ordinances, one in 84, one in 85, and then one in 87. And Jefferson's the one who kind of constructs the 84 one before he goes to Paris. And they kind of begin this idea of we can organize these, we can use Enlightenment thought process to get it very specific, lay out partials and all this kind of stuff. But they never really got into the rules designed for it the way they wanted to, mostly because of slavery. The slavery issue continued to vex Congress, and so there was challenges there. But because they were running into financial problems, by the time they get to 86, they're like, we need to fix this because we need to sell some land. And at that time, as I told you in the Ohio talk, you started having people from New England who were saying, we want to give you a lot of money. So let us do it so we can organize. And this obviously is just Ohio, but you started having companies like the Ohio Company Purchase, which were from people from New England who were trying to establish it. So they sell this land, and they set up a series of rules. And again, they laid out, they didn't mean it this way, but what was decided in the Northwest Territories became the rules for all the rest of our lands. So everything we've done since then to bring in new states has been based on the Northwest Territory ordinances and the rules constructed there. One of the most important rules that they came up with was the fact that any new state would be equal to the original 13. I mean, if you think about it for a second, you can go, oh, they didn't have to do that, did they? They could have said like the 13 would maybe like have a veto, like the 5 major powers have the veto in the UN Security Council. The 13 could have, we were here first, so we're going to have more power than everybody else. And they said, no, let's not do that. And that was kind of cool. You do see this question about the moral virtue foundation and how the Articles of Confederation government was looking at the issue of where faith lies, where it doesn't lie. So you can see Congress specifically requested money and support for education because education to them would be the place where you would teach the children about the moral virtue foundation. That's where that would be taught, so then they would learn. However, we weren't going to give money to build churches, so that was another aspect of how they're trying to walk this kind of tightrope in between. In any case, the Articles gets all messy, and as many of you know, it happens mostly in Massachusetts. Daniel Shays is technically not the leader. He's just the guy whose name who gets connected to it. There were a series of various people like Shays who had participated in the Revolutionary War period, and so amongst his friends, he was seen as somebody of importance. Daniel didn't start it. He wasn't trying to put his name with this thing. But what they're really arguing about is they're feeling the same feeling that the U.S. American patriots felt, in that there was a government far away from us while we're out here on the frontier, and they're taxing us indiscriminately in ways that we don't feel like we have a voice into. Right? So that's whether that you did or didn't have a voice into, that's all part of the conversation about the revolution and what that thing looks like. But ultimately it led to a major clash and people were killed. And so people are starting to go, whoa, this isn't good. And it wasn't just there. As you can see, states like New York and New Jersey, they were inching closer and closer to an open war over who controlled trade on the Hudson. And in their minds, I, the nation of New York, and I, the nation of New Jersey, have a right to fight, even by arms if necessary, over something we believe vital to our future success, i.e. the Hudson River. And notice how none of them are somehow thinking that the federal government has any say-so about this at all. There's no thought in their minds for this. Last thing, you can see then, because of that trade issue, that they did think maybe we should have some control. So they start thinking about it, and they actually put together a committee to try to come up with a new amendment to drop into the Articles. James Monroe was the person who was on the committee, and as you can probably guess, that went nowhere. And so they get the thing passed, but it basically fails. Remember, the Articles of Confederation, part of their decision making in 76, linking back into choices that were made with the Declaration, was that all decisions about amending needed to be unanimous. Now, if you've ever worked on any group at all, Little League, right? Certainly an HOA, a group of professors trying to decide about something. Unanimity is a fool's gold errand, right? But they didn't see it that way, and if you remember our conversation about passing the Declaration, they passed it with the first vote. And they're like, this ain't good enough, we need to be unanimous. In any case, that stuck with them. So you've got this situation where, okay, things don't look good. And this is really the thing that seems most clear about pushing Madison to make the moves he makes. So Madison's a member of Congress. He's been there through all the time. He was a faithful member, so he's been there through all the times when there's no quorum, there's nothing getting done, the frustration that would be, leaving your home and trying to get there. He's talking to Jefferson all the time, so you can see Jefferson's thoughts here in a letter to Madison, and you can see other thoughts. So Washington is starting to really notice this. He's got several people writing him, so this last thing here, Jacob Reed, this is a letter to Washington, and they're all basically saying the same thing, which is, hey, all the people of distinction, or many of the people of distinction, are not interested in serving at the national level, they're only serving at the state level. This is a problem. And this is beginning to resonate with people like Madison. He's not alone. There are others, Alexander Hamilton most famously, but there are many others who are starting to say, like 5-6 years in, I don't think this system's working to success the way we think. And so they begin to make an argument that says, hey, look, we need to get rid of this. We need to make some changes. So again, that's the very first decision that we talk about compromises in a second. That's the very first one. What are we trying to do? We're trying to amend the system as we have it, or are we going to ditch it and do something new? Most support for change would have been in the amend category. But Madison had a different thing going on in his head. He's thinking, we can't fix this. This is problematic. And so they begin to look and call for reforms. Madison's one of the many people who are writing Washington, kind of getting the tone of Washington. Like, what do you think? Because they would often say to him, dear General, your reputation will rise or fall on whether or not we succeed at this thing. So you see this, right? You might need to step into this. But Washington was never a politically minded person. He was never like a politician, thinking person of wanting to be involved in like the levers of government kind of thing. So even though he would agree with, yeah, it doesn't look good, and he would somehow wish for it to be fixed, he's not down that road from like, well, let me write into the story and try to propose something. And so this is leaving Madison to say, okay, well, what can I do? So what Madison does is using the failure of the trade thing and the threat of war between New York and New Jersey to get the Articles of Confederation Congress, in a rare moment with a quorum, to call for a national meeting to happen in Annapolis. And the meeting was going to be about trade, this trade thing. Right? So let's talk this through. You again can see the strength of the national government because they only got, oh, it's not up there, they only got like 5 states to show up. But they have enough motion there, and they have this meeting, and they're having this discussion, that Madison is able to come away and get the committee, the people who do arrive, to agree to a request to the AOC to have a convention in May of 1787 for a full revision. And again, notice what he asked for. It's a full amendment revision to the Articles, not the right of government. Okay? The Articles of Confederation Congress approves it. So you've got from September 86 to May 87. Now just think about today. If anybody said, I think we should have National Constitutional Convention because we need to change the whole thing, And imagine it was a leader of some substance, has some ability, some fans in his or her back pocket, and you start hearing momentum building in this direction for this to happen. You've got, 9 months between the two meetings. Just imagine the brouhaha and the fanfare that would hit the fan as people were debating and arguing and questioning. And that same exact thing happens here. One of the things that many people aren't as aware of as I would wish for them to, although we've just discussed it here many times, is that many of the rock stars of the revolution were deeply opposed to this. And they were opposed to it before it got started. So it's not like they were opposed once they read it. They were definitely opposed once they read it. But they were opposed on the front side. So when you think about, and I've done talks here, again on my website, you can find discussions about the ratification process. We're not covering that today. But when you look at the ratification process, when you go through it, many people are just shocked at how narrow it was. And so again, when you sometimes look at our election decisions and things, and you're worried about how are only 40% or 50% or however you do the math on that most recent decision or most recent election, hopefully a little bit of solace can come to your mind and say, well, that just seems like that's how we always vote. Because the Constitution itself was barely passed. And when Washington was elected, he was a president over 11 states, not 13. Because North Carolina and Rhode Island rejected it, and they were going to ride out their lives and see what could happen. And North Carolina made a quick switch once the amendment process happened, and Rhode Island said, screw you, we ain't doing it. And we literally had to threaten them with first economic war and then war before Rhode Islanders decided, okay, fine, maybe we'll join up and play with you guys. So there wasn't this sense of, yay, we wrote a new government and everybody's happy, woohoo, that foolish thing before is over. No, these guys hated it. And you can see they're throwing out the treason word right off the bat. Both in the sense of the idea of you're betraying the sentiment of the revolution, because remind yourself, what was the revolution? It was a revolution against a centralized government led by a powerful executive. And so they're like, I see what y'all are going to do. I see where you're heading. And in fact, the way you can say it, because this is the way they would say it, Madison would disagree, just to give him defense for a second, is they're moving from Locke to Hobbes. Because in Hobbes' worldview, people are not naturally good. They are instead naturally self-focused. And because they're self-focused, they will do what they perceive to be best for them in the moment, which I would say has been largely my experience with the human race. Not good or bad. We don't use the word selfish because that's got moral baggage and we all hate that. Carl is self-focused. And I know some of you, you're self-focused. Right? So Hobbes is saying, how do you mitigate with that in a system? And his position, which I'm not sure that's necessarily the only answer, I'm not sure it's the best answer, was that you put most, if not all, power in the central government. So these guys here, and including obviously Mercy here, are like, no, that's not a good plan. I didn't sign up for that. So they're determined to fight it. And so they are going to fight it. And so this question then will dive in, and you can see back to my dissertation and my thought process of my idea is, well, what's happening in the area of religion, right? So each of the 13 states had written their own state constitutions. And for each of the 13 states, they had drawn to different conclusions. And you can see how that plays out here. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but if you were a citizen of that state and you valued either this or, 4 states have no mention. We don't want anything to do with religion. So if you're a citizen of that state, you might be afraid that these 9 states might take over and then force it on you. So they were all thinking in terms of, I want to just do what we want to do here. And you do what you want to do there. You go right ahead with your thing, right? And you had South Carolina, it was the only one that had an official state religion, which then they altered it a couple different times and amended it. And then once our Constitution is passed, they got rid of that. But going into it, they have a state religion. Some of them had a religious tax. Whether you were of the religion or not, whether you claim to be a Christian or not, you're paying a tax. We would use the religious term, a tithe, but you're paying a tax. Same thing Constantine did. Once he didn't do it. The same thing that happened for Christianity once it became the legal religion in the empire, which we're going to talk about that in another month. And so, the different positions are one of a variety, which the then founders, back to those four as examples of who were opposing this move, said is a benefit or a plus to us. Remember, the weak central government is not a flaw, it's a feature. So they're thinking this is an example of that. So they're worried about this process. The opposition continued. Rhode Island's like, yeah, we're not coming. Sorry. Do what you want, we're not doing it. Some places had people show up and leave. So North Carolina, most famously, and again, we're not surprised they vote against it, their representatives, I think they sent 4, I think it was 3, but their representatives got there, heard the first several days of meeting, and they're like, y'all are about to commit treason. I'm out. And they rode home. Now then other pro-Madison viewpoint North Carolinians took their place. But again, you can already see, oh, North Carolina's got some key leaders who are like, yeah, this is not going to fly. It doesn't help Madison's cause that the first thing they decide is complete secrecy. Now again, if you've ever been a leader, if you've ever been in organizing or you've been on the committee that's dealing with something contentious, you know keeping it quiet till you come to a decision is a good idea. Because then you avoid everybody else chirping and sneaking in with their thoughts. Just let us get to a place and then you can attack it. But to the people who are already thinking treason is happening, you can already see it, right? And so that really, kind of chaps them big time. The one defense Madison had was the shield of George Washington. So Washington was not going to come for the reasons I already told you. And they finally appealed to him to say, you have to come. You've got to be there. And of course, once he was there, he's immediately elected chair, which meant he was happy to note, I don't have to say anything. So he basically said nothing the whole time, but like 3 times recorded that Washington said anything, and he just left the talking to the politicians while he's just there. Because for everybody like a Sam Adams or Mercy Otis Warren who wants to say, y'all are committing treason, the response was, you're accusing George Washington of treason? And then that settles it, right? So that was really sharp on Madison's case to kind of be there in the part. And now he recognizes going in, he's not going to get everything that he wants. He's going to have to figure out how to navigate through this because of all these people with these different viewpoints. He starts off with the first thing of, we're not going to amend the articles. We're going to replace them. And he starts putting all his cards on the table about what he wants to do. And it was extensive. As you can note, he wanted the federal government to have a veto over state laws. Can you imagine that today? I mean, maybe you can, but just imagine how that works out. Random state of our 50 passes some random law, and somebody in Congress doesn't like it, and so they have the Congress veto the law of Wisconsin or the law of New Mexico. So that's how much power Madison won. Again, my statement, come on, James, you're really doing the Hobbesian thing. That's what you're asking for, whether you want to admit it or not. In the end, the decision to lean into the compromises was the successful, aspect of our recipe. It's the secret sauce, because the ambiguity that they walked away with allowed for an elasticity that has so far worked for us for, going on 240 years. But to get to the compromises, Madison had to be willing to give up a lot of things that he cared about. So let's walk through these. We've done these before if you've been here. But when we walk through these, the last part of our day, we're going to just look at the Constitution. And I got a link for you, so if you don't want to Google it, how to find it yourself, all right? So these are the major compromises. Again, fix it or replace it. They chose replace it. How do we do legislative? For them, legislative was the key thing. By the way, that's a clue for you to recognize how far we've changed the system in our own mindsets. Because most people in America believe the president's the most powerful. They never thought the president was most powerful. We'll come back to that. So, do we want to do unicameral or bicameral? Now, the leading thinker in constitutional writing at the time is not James Madison. Sorry, he is the father of the Constitution, but he's not the leading thinker. That's John Adams. And Adams already demonstrated, along with Montesquieu, that the best way to protect a people trying this kind of a system of some sort of citizen inclusion was to take the power that you would have, so this is the power in a pie, we got to split it, we got to divide it somehow so that only certain parts of the government can do certain things. So that's the idea. So that's why bicameral legislation became the more popular. That's where Madison starts, but he also wants in his bicameral legislation, 2 houses, no names at that point, to both be elected by proportion, by how many people are there. So that's why this is called the Virginia Plan, right? New Jersey wanted to go back to a unicameral, and they wanted it by equal by the states. And they get into this long debate. It's the exact same debate that they had at the Articles of Confederation. They go through this a lot in '76, where they're debating which is better. And obviously the larger states are like, hey, we're paying more taxes. There's more of us if there's a war. We're doing a whole bunch more things. We should have more of a vote. And then, of course, the smaller states are like, you're going to all gang up on us. You're going to attack us. We think it should be equal because we're all equal here in the story. And forget our size. I got nothing to do with it. Some of that's just the way history kind of fortuitously gave you Virginia more land than it gave us Maryland. Just kind of worked out that way. So it should be equal. So as you probably know, they end up with what is known as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise, because the leaders of Connecticut said, hey, I got an idea. What if we do the bicameral thing, but one house is by population, one house is equal? So that's the first conclusion. Like, okay, sounds good. Next, but how do we choose these people? Remember, the Articles of Confederation, the power lay with the state. So the states having control or voice, even at the federal level. Even if they didn't come, the states still felt like they had power and control over the federal level. So we still want that. So they're kind of debating back and forth, what's our decision? Well, as you know, the first is to give their one nod to democracy. If you read anything from the founders, one of the clearest things you can see is they had never, ever, 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 ever wanted us to be seen, known as, or called a democracy. Ever. And it's here. They're going to give one little nod to, we'll let the House be this one little place. For those of you who need to scratch that little itch and you erroneously think democracies are good, okay, here's your spot. The citizens can vote. The Senate, which we've ruined, but the Senate was designed to be basically a system of ambassadors from the state to the Fed, controlled by the state. How's it controlled by the state? The state legislatures control it. If you think your way through it, it actually echoes or stands with one of the key features that most founders believed, which was governing power is best when it's closest to the people. So if you go, well, wait, how would that be closest to the people? Who controls the senators? The state legislature. Who controls the state legislature? The voters of that state. There's less constituents voting for each representative at the state legislatures than there is at the national level. So instead of having 21 million people voting for 2 senators here in Florida, which by the way the founders would be aghast at, you would have whatever our number is for our voting for Florida representatives. And as you know, we still have some level, it's not fully there, because again we're so big, but we have some level by which you know you're a Florida representative, or you could, and some of you may go, I know where you live. And that was a key part of what they meant when government should be close. That you as the representative or senator or the governor, whoever, would say, I know where you live. So I can find you. I'll see you in Publix. And so then if I don't like what the senator's voting for, I don't complain to the senator because he's going to listen to 1 out of 21 million people. But I talk to my state legislator who sent him there. And you, I can kick out of office because I know where you live. I'll have my friends come get you. It actually was a quite brilliant plan in the way they had it designed. And again, we've kind of screwed it up. So Adams agrees with this. He thinks this is great. Now, what's interesting, what Adams wanted was that he wanted 2 houses, and he wanted one house preserved only for the wealthy elite. That's a whole different conversation, but his point was you can't ignore the wealthy of the land because their wealth won't let you. But you can't try to control them either because their wealth won't let you. So you need to put them somewhere where they have agency and voice, but it's controlled because it's only got part of the power and the other parts of the government have the other parts of the power. And that's not what they did, but still it's interesting to see how he viewed the House and the Senate. And notice also Adams is the first to advocate for an independent, non-political judiciary. And he pulled that off in Massachusetts. Next one. This is the one that's most egregious and bugs most of us, and it should. How are we going to include slaves? Now we've got the states set up, we know how they're going to vote, but that voting thing is back to, for the House, how many people do you have? And so we're like, oh, you got that many white males. That's how many people you have. Whoa, 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 wait a minute. We got a whole bunch of other males. Well, they're slaves, aren't they property? And so that debate goes back and forth. And again, this is not the first time or the last time that they'll be in this debate. I'm sure you've had lots of research and study about the slavery issue. Ultimately, they do choose this egregious. Don't soften it by saying, for every 5 slaves, there was 3 slaves. And that's not what they said. Don't go, oh, it was whatever the percentage of 3/5. That's what they meant. No, no, no. They were more egregious and more insulting than that. And we have to own it. But they said they're 3/5 of a person. And so that was the decision that they ended up with. It should offend you, and hopefully you're glad it's gone. So that debate. But now what will this do? Back to your thoughts of Civil War. This will give the South an outsized voting block in the House. And remember, how do we get to the Electoral College, which we're about to get to? Number of representatives and senators. So they're going to have an outsized reach on the president. And then who puts people on the Supreme Court? The president. And if you study the country between the constitutional founding and the Civil War, you'll find the vast majority of leaders of the nation are Southern, including our justices, our presidents, our cabinet members, because they have this outsized reach. However, in their defense for this egregious decision, it is very clear that the Southern states, certainly South Carolina, and they would have taken North and Georgia with them, would have walked. They would have walked away. You and I might say, good, we're letting Rhode Island walk away. Let them walk away. We'll deal with them later. But that's not the decision that they wanted to make. How do we choose the chief executive? Having a chief executive was perhaps the more controversial thing, but they did in the nation. But in the room, they kind of agreed we need something. And again, they're thinking checks and balances. So in the articles, there's only Congress. And remember, the check and balances between the Fed and the state. So they're thinking, we're going to have all the power, or most of it, here at the Fed. We need to divide the power. We need something to counterbalance the Congress. Now again, initially, and as we're going to see as they just structure it, this is not how we think now, sadly, the House and the Senate are also a check and a balance on each other. They're at odds with each other. In other words, even if you ask our founders who are the Federalists, not the Anti-Federalists, and you say, oh, but nothing gets done because the House and the Senate hate each other, they would have said, good. Because the last thing you want is a federal government running amok, doing a bunch of stuff. Which for us, post-urban America, post-progressivism, we're like shocked at that. But I'm just saying, that's what the founders would have thought. And so they saw them at odds. However, they wanted another check against Congress, and that's where the executive comes in. But how are we going to pick him? Well, God forbid we let the people vote. Nobody thought that except maybe Franklin. Everybody else is like, that's the craziest thing you've ever heard of. Because what will you get? You'll get a popularity contest. Think about all the places you have worked. Think about your HOA. Think about anything you're involved with that is of significance. Do you want just some Tom, Dick, or Harry, or Jane, or Julie, or Susan just randomly picked because everybody happens to like them to run your business, your retirement plan, be your plumber? Most of us would say, no, I want to go through all the different things I can go through and pick somebody, even if nobody likes them, they're the best person to be my accountant. That's what they were saying. So again, you should say to yourself, wait, why do we vote for the president? That's a different conversation. In any case, they wanted to make sure that there was a way to balance the state. And so they end up with the Electoral College. And their thought process, I would suggest to the founders they did not think this well through, related to human nature. But their thought process was, oh, the state will just pick some of the best and the brightest from their state, and then they'll get in a room and they'll have a dispassionate conversation. And I'm like, again, dudes, have you ever been around people? I mean, I'm sorry, that's not going to work either. So even though I continue to defend the Electoral College, I am willing to acknowledge that it's got flaws relative to the human nature thing. Last compromise, who controls the external trade? Back where Madison started, right? Who's going to control that? Not surprisingly, you should not be surprised to find out that Southerners didn't want anybody to control it because they were wanting to have a continued external slave trade. And so ultimately the decision is, you will support this, that the federal government will control all trade, and in response, we'll give you 20 years of unfettered, continued slave trading, and in 1808, we'll cancel that bad boy. And they did, and the South largely in 1808 went along with it and said, okay, fine. I've always, perhaps coarsely, so forgive me on the front side, joked and said that by 1808 they were kind of like, yeah, we got enough slaves inside, we'll just kind of grow our finances, our secondary income stream through internal slave trading, which is the horrific concept of dividing families, having people have babies, selling those babies. And again, we should all be offended by that. But nonetheless, that's what they did. And so with that, you kind of come to the place where they were done and they put it all down on paper. So just so you know, one of the things that matters to me is that you are reading the same documents I'm reading. So we're going to literally walk through the Constitution bit by bit here. And I wanted you, if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, be my check and watch me, you can see it and you can read it at the National Archives yourself as we're going through. I'm not going to be quoting it at length, but you could be scanning along as you go to see what's there. The National Archives version is, as you can see, it is the full text as inscribed by Jacob Shallis on parchment, and spelling and punctuation are original. If you want a different one, just go to Google, U.S. Constitution. You'll find lots of places that will give it to you. All right, everybody good? We okay? Again, you can get to Google. If this doesn't work for you, go to Google. And you don't have to at all, I promise. I'm not going to lie to you. I have checked. But I want you to be able to be my check. Everybody good? We okay?
We're good.
All right, love it. Let's go. Article 1. Well, this tells you a lot. Article 1 is about the legislature. Yes, there's a preamble. That was later written, and it's on my tie if you want to see it. It's actually controversial. One of the things when you do the ratification story, which we're not today, it's one of the things the anti-federalists jump on. They're like, who in the world gave you the right to say we the people? Because we the people ain't got nothing to do with this. It's the states. We founded this bad boy. We're the ones who won that war. We got it going. You can't put people on there. Of course, we did, and that's the thing many of us, if we memorize something from our days of Schoolhouse Rock, then we got we the people, right, in order to form a more perfect union. But they dive right in with the legislature, and it is the longest one. So sections 2 and 3 describe it. They kind of talk how they're going to work through it. They give some of the rules. They give the power of impeachment to the Senate. And again, you need to remember, at least that beginning structure, when you read about the Senate and you read about the House, they are two independent groups that are, to some degree, at odds with each other. Yes, there's an idea that at the end of our debating, we'll come to something that we say is the final bill. But the whole point is for them to knock heads with each other, largely in the minds of the founders, so they don't do a lot of stuff. That's what they're working from. 4 to 6 go through elections, internal rulemaking, discipline, which we've not done that much, and pay. That was controversial, actually, the pay, which becomes part of the original amendments. It didn't pass, it did eventually. You do know the amendments, our first amendment was our third amendment. Amendments 1 and 2 do not pass. And number 2, I think it was the one talking about money. Then, they're dividing some stuff out. Article 7, the House will be the bills for raising revenue. Why? Because it's the people's house. It's the one and only place the people have a rep. The president is never the people's representative. The senators are never the people's representatives. That was the mindset of the founders. I know it's different today, but that's the idea of the design. So if we're going to take money from you as a citizen, who should okay it? Remember, no taxation without representation, remember the little story, right? Who's going to do it? Well, the person you voted for. So who is that? The House. And just there alone, I can stop here and we're done for the whole session. You can show how screwed up we are, because what happens every year? Everybody waits for who to tell us what about the budget? The president. And I'm still waiting on a president, we haven't had one in a long time, who says, stop asking me, it ain't my job, I ain't doing it, I got no thoughts. They don't do that, whole different conversation, but. And then Section 8, you can, again, if you're reading there, this is a long one. 17 sections is where they have the powers of Congress. You can see, I just kind of wrote down 5 biggies, but this is kind of where they go. This is their whole point of kind of walking through what are the ideas within the articles. This is where you can see one of the most brilliant, and I do think it was intentional, but maybe they didn't mean it intentionally, but it becomes evidence of their ambiguity because it gets to this idea of implied versus expressed powers. Or the way we sometimes talk about it is the idea of loose or strict construction. this becomes really the central debate between the anti-federalists and the federalists, in which, well, what can Congress or the federal government do? And in a strict construction viewpoint, which is where Madison is, the Congress and the government can only do what is specifically stated it is allowed to do. So a modern example, can they regulate the internet? No. Why not? Because it's not in the Constitution. And you can try to tie it in, but that's not commerce. Nope, doesn't say internet, you're wrong. And then you can see how that becomes very problematic, because we're like, well, I think they probably should have some regulation about stuff we do. Does that make sense for everybody? Right? If you do know the story of Washington, if you've seen Hamilton, you know one of the battles is about a national bank. It's one of the big battles. And the strict constructionist, Madison, can't do that. Why not? It's not in the Constitution. Period. Loose construction says the government can do anything it wants unless it's expressly prohibited. So, is the internet regulating that expressly prohibited? Again, no, they don't know that word. So then we can do it. Is the bank expressly prohibited? No. Then we can do it. Can you see the challenge here? And quite honestly, there's never been an answer to this. And maybe there shouldn't be one. Sometimes you may feel like I do, that I wish we had like a little dictionary that the founders had given us. Like, here's this word, we mean this. Here's this word, we mean this. But if you were that narrow and tight, we probably already would have rewritten a new constitution, which maybe that'd be useful, but we'd have to rewrite a constitution, because without the elasticity, it couldn't expand and move with us as we've gone into different times. Again, that's a merit. You could debate that, but that's the idea there. So, at the end of this long section here in section 8, there's this thing where the Congress may do whatever is, quote, necessary and proper. I mean, that's the statement. Everything else is there. Just look at it as, etc. What can I do? Blah, 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 etc. What does that mean? We don't know. Again, they might have very narrowly given you and me a definition of necessary and proper, but they didn't. So we're kind of left to the devices. And again, this will be a key battleground to this very day. You don't hear people talk about the question of whether we're talking about loose and strict construction. That's mostly because from Washington on, every president has been a loose constructionist because it's to their benefit. Jefferson harped on it against Adams in particular, but Adams and Washington, and really castigated them for failing to be a strict constructionist until he became the president, and then he wanted to buy Louisiana, and he's like, oh yeah, I guess this is a good idea. And so basically every president has done loose construction, and probably every Congress has leaned into it also, but still, when you hear the debates, and we're having them right now, it happens to be verbalized in things around executive actions, which since FDR, every president has done ad nauseum. So every president has done them. But somebody doesn't like one of them, and they'll usually make some claim about the Constitution. That's really a debate between the person and the person they're accusing or whatever over loose and strict construction. That's really what you're looking at that moment. So they don't solve it. And yeah. So, section 9, this gets overlooked all the time. And this was Madison's argument when ratification was going down, because, again, he was accused of not doing certain things, as we'll see in a minute, in particular around religion. And his attitude was like, it's not allowed. It's not allowed. Not partially not allowed because of strict construction. Religion wasn't denied here in this set of the 8 denials. But again, he's like, look, we've taken pains to limit Congress. To the anti-federalist, not enough. Again, too much power to the federal government and not enough rules, hence what you and I know as our Bill of Rights, which really just technically the first 8 amendments, because 9 and 10 don't do anything about rights. So the first 8 amendments are talking about defining and limiting Congress. Congress shall make no law. That's kind of how they start there. And then section 10 kind of lays out a series of limitations to the state. And this is important because Amendment 10 is the one that says, hey, anything not mentioned here, the states can control, which of course all the loose constructionists harped on to that, as well as all the states' rights advocates. So you can already see this. We sort of set things up where we're going to end up with some tensions, in the process. All right. Any questions about Congress? You probably have lots of questions about Congress. Any questions about what they set up for Congress? The executive branch. Again, just in case you're not clear about it, you can see very easily how many sections? 10, 4, and then judicials we'll see is kind of like an afterthought. Yes, sir?
Was there any discussion about term limits?
Was there any discussion about term limits? No, because they believed only a fool would want to be there all the time. Now, they immediately broke their own mindset because Madison, John Quincy Adams, so two different parties you might say, immediately fell in love with the place and wanted to stay. And they did stay. And they were there elected till basically, in John Quincy Adams' case, literally his death on the floor. But they just never thought that would happen. And for the Senate, they really believed that the citizens would be turning over their state legislatures enough that that would be a revolving door of the Senate. In their mindset, a person, you'd almost could imagine like, that there's 6 or 7 people who could be the senator, the ambassador. So you go first, and then she'll go next, and then he'll go third, and then she'll go fourth. And so I don't care whether you like it or not, you're coming back after 6 years because it's her term. And you see that a lot. If you go and do the research, the average term limit for senators going up until we foolishly changed it was about 8 years. After that, it's been a lifetime. I mean, they're like 28 or 29 years is the average. So they didn't think it was necessary because nobody would want to be there, kind of a thing. Again, Henry Clay proves them wrong, Andrew Jackson proves them wrong. So there's a whole bunch of people, Thomas Bennett, and there's a lot of people you can look at who, early on, we start seeing people choose the career of politician. So their sentiment that nobody would want it was flawed when they thought that way. But they didn't need to write it in because they just assumed nobody would want to do that. It's a great question. Okay, so section 1 for the president just talks how we're going to get there, what his pay is going to be in the oath of office, which is this. We'll come back to this idea later. But this is the oath that's in there. Again, you can read it for yourself there as you're scanning along. That's the oath. That's what he does. So, section 2 lays out the very limited powers of the president. The president is a figurehead with some things to do. The idea of a cabinet, it is not in the Constitution. Washington takes the concept of leading the executive departments. So, this has come up recently. The Department of War, which will be Henry Knox's thing. The Department of State, the Department of Treasury. Those are things that there would be departments. And so he's like, I'll just have whoever the leader is meet with me on a regular basis. And they'll be my cabinet. But it's all a Washingtonian viewpoint of design as how he did it. And so, again, I'm not at all talking about any specific person. I have had beef with our structure since we made some of the most significant changes in the early 20th century. All right, so I'm not talking about anybody specifically. But when you see the country in love, and I would suggest, certainly, I can think of numerous people, somebody who I loved, President Reagan, so let's go there, right? To an idolatrous level and expectation, then you can see something has happened in us as a people compared to the design. Again, we could say, well, we're just going to write a new constitution where the president does do everything, because that's what we want. Okay, groovy. But in our design, that's not what they set up. And again, my premise is for us to say, if the food coming out of the kitchen is bad, we've lost the recipe. What's on the recipe might be useful for us to go back and do that. So that's what, again, so you understand where I'm going. You don't have to agree with me. Just want you to understand where I'm going, and that I'm not picking on any current or recent presidents. I'm talking about the whole system in the process. Section 3 is he gets to give information or recommend measures as he may judge necessary to Congress. Now this is connected to where we get the idea of the State of the Union, but it suggested that maybe the president could suggest laws that would be a benefit. Different presidents have tried it. Washington really only did something like that once, and he felt attacked by the senators and the representatives, and so he never went back. But other presidents have thought that was quite useful. And then the idea of impeachment is in section 4. All right? Everybody good? The judicial one. My joke is that when they got to this part, they retired, and they're just like, okay, fine, we'll have judges like Adams wants. And they'll just do judgy stuff. I don't know what they're going to do. Well, the Supreme Court of the land, what will it do? I don't know. And if you study the Supreme Court until you get to Marshall in 1803, Madison v. Marbury, so basically 15, 16 years, they did nothing. They did nothing. They had nothing to do. He sent John Jay on a diplomatic mission. I mean, can you imagine the president sending any Supreme Court Chief Justice? You need to go for 3 years and go be on a diplomatic mission. No, we can't imagine that because they're busy doing judgy stuff. But back then, nobody knew what they were going to do. So they had kind of this idea that only 3 articles in it. They do give 9 spheres of the power, and it's connected to character of the cause and character of the parties. And we had a talk on the Supreme Court branch specifically, I think it was last year. That one's not filmed because those are my friends giving it. So you can see for yourself, again, go read the Constitution. The character of the cause is this, right? So under the Constitution, made under their authority, so cases arising under the Constitution. This is probably where judicial review in Marshall's mind was linking to, but I'll just note for you, it doesn't say judicial review. We'll come back to that in a minute. Anything about our ambassadors or public ministers, and then the admiralty and maritime. Seems kind of random that it's admiralty and maritime, but nonetheless, they're thinking that's not on ground anywhere. So what court would they go to? They're on the water. Well, you would ultimately, I guess, just come to the Supreme Court. And then character of the parties. So it's kind of like these are ones they could have. Again, we're looking at do you have original jurisdiction? That's what you're really getting to. And again, for the Supreme Court, it's very, very narrow. One of you might can tell me this. Can you remember a time when the Supreme Court took a case as an original case, like the first case? I can't. I didn't look for it. Maybe you might find one if you Googled it or something. They're all appellate, as far as I am aware, and they're all kind of revolving their way, through appeals. But in any case, they can take these controversies here. So these 6, and you can see how they kind of lay out there. And so, I mean, citizens of different states. One could imagine that somebody might have a case between somebody in another state and then want to go straight to the Supreme Court. Again, I've never heard that happening. Maybe it does, and I just have never heard it happening. But anyway, these 9, so these 3, these 6, they're kind of the only thing listed, so it's something. So I'm wrong. I'm a little being too unfair when I say they did just do judgy stuff, because it's there, and it's kind of in the process. Here you can kind of see how it's all designed itself over the years from an appellate point of view. And so basically, again, they really only have appellate jurisdiction for basically everything. Note again, at this point, that's it. So let me show you this slide. I'll come back, I promise. Right? So this is a typical textbook kind of graphic for students. And so look at judicial. What's the first thing that's listed? That is not in the Constitution. It's just not there. Neither is, again, a cabinet. So again, we're like, So you have to go study what Marshall does, why he does it, Madison v. Marbury, to understand where but this technically should not be here. You and I have all been taught, again, thank you, Schoolhouse Rock, that there's this division between Congress as a whole, the president, and the Supreme Court. That's not the Constitution's design. Constitution's design is House versus Senate, and then collectively House and Senate versus president, and the Supreme Court's just kind of minding those business doing court stuff. Marshall's the one who says, I think, and again, I do think he's looking at this right here, I think Marshall's like, we can take this and we'll reach over to England and grab the idea of judicial review where they're in England, their Supreme Court had the right to observe and declare, they wouldn't use unconstitutional, what word would they use, Michael? Something about the king. They would have said, no, that law, can't do that law. Right? It wasn't unconstitutional, but they had a right to block a law of the king, the high court of the land, if they wanted to. So that's where I think that he's getting it from. But still, it's not there. And then section 3 randomly has got treason here. I don't know why it's there. I tried to figure that one out, and it's just sort of, I guess because treason cases end up in the Supreme Court, so they thought, well, let's go ahead and explain why treason is there in the process. But so that's kind of where they're at. All right? So this then is the separation of powers. It is largely correct, except for this. Here again, you might say, wait, I didn't know that he could propose laws. And I think most presidents don't directly, like they don't write a bill. But there have been many presidents who have either said at times like the State of the Union address or in other settings, I mean, You could arguably say Lincoln's the reason we have a 13th Amendment, which starts as a bill in our Congress in 1864, 5, in that process, because he pushed for it. So you get that idea of the process. And obviously there's more here. This needs to be like this long because they have so much more to do. All right, everybody good? Yes, sir.
The executive has the power of pardon. What was the thinking giving the executive that?
It was connected to, where is it? Yeah. Yeah, it's there, but I thought I had it somewhere else also. It was connected to federal laws that somebody may have been afoul of, and to simplify it, it was another check on the balance. That if the Supreme Court did something that the president thought was an incorrect move relative to legality and law for someone in a jury trial, that he could, if he wished, pass pardon. So Washington famously does this with the Whiskey Rebellion in 1792, 93, where there's a complete opposition to a tax that had been passed. And there's an open rebellion. He sends the army over the Allegheny Mountains to go find these guys, led by Alexander Hamilton. A bunch of arrests are made, and they're tried, and they're convicted, and they're sentenced to death. And then, not at the last minute, but then Washington communes, gives them a pardon. In his mind, he wasn't suggesting that the sentence of death was wrong. He was trying to show magnanimity and say, hey, I'm going to give you a pass this time. But it's that kind of idea.
Okay.
Yep. Oh, there was someone here. Oh, maybe not. Okay. All right. So not done yet. Article 4. So Article 4 and 5 and 6 become, well, 4 and 5 become kind of a catch-all type of thing. I really do think that's what it was. It's sort of like, well, we got other things we should put in here. Well, let's put them in. So they do. So there's no real connection, in my opinion. A political scientist or a constitutional scholar might have a different thing to say. So they kind of talk in different sections, which again, you can read. I showed you where to find it. So here it's kind of like, hey, we want to deal with unity, and want to make sure, like, for instance, nobody's doing anything against other citizens. And then Congress has full control, so like you couldn't form a new state or merger of these two states. In other words, Congress is exerting, or the founders are exerting that Congress will have the domineering power relative to decision making over the states. This is another example of that. And then in section 4, they're like, hey, by the way, we're a republic. In this case, it's not clear. Again, it sort of seems as you read Article 4, to me, it seems like a random collection of things that are kind of tossed in there in the process. Then Article 5 lays out the amending process. So really, 1, 2, and 3, that's it. That's the government. And then they're sort of like, well, we got a few more things we should do. Okay, well, let's make sure that's clear. Make sure no state's going to do some other things. Make sure everybody's going to respect each other's citizens. And they sort of left it. That's in 4. And they're like, oh, wait, well, what if we want to fix it? Oh, yes, because that was a problem. Because in the articles, remember, it was unanimous. We're like, we're not going to do that. So it's a 2/3, 3/4 thing. And we've had it 20, are we up to 25? I think we're at 25 or 26 amendments. So 2/3 either of the Congress or 2/3 of a national convention that's called by Congress. That one's never happened, I don't think. If there's 2/3, then the amendment goes to be voted for. And then once the vote happens, 3/4 have to pass it. It's a high bar, but it's not unanimous. So that's kind of the way to look at it. And if you follow these little lines, again, both A and B can choose C and D. So C is you let the state's legislatures vote for it, which is what's been done most of the time, or you have conventions called, which is what they actually do for the ratification of the document itself. It's about to show you, mostly because they realize if they send it to the state legislatures, it would lose, and lose big, because the state legislatures would not support giving away the power that they currently had in that process. Any questions? And then 6, again, sort of another catch-all, where we're going to have all the debts are still valid. You still owe people money, sorry. Then they drop in the supremacy clause, just in case it wasn't clear previously. Again, Madison's liking this. It's not what he wanted. Remember, he wanted a full-on veto, that Congress could veto any law in any state, but they get that. Then they have an oath for them that is not prescribed or written. So the president's is written, everybody else's is not written, but it is stated that no religious test shall ever be required. So that is an answer to the 9 states that had a specific oath requiring a connection to Christianity. So like, yeah, we're not going to do that in that kind of process. 7 is ratification. Again, it's very simple. So we're going to ratify only 9 states. That immediately gets objections because you're changing our government and the rules for changing the government were unanimous. And Madison and the crew's like, no, we don't care. We're just going to try and do it anyway and see what happens. And they pass barely. Again, we're not going to go into it, but if you go through it, you can look. It's kind of hard to see from where you are maybe, but all the orange is against. So most of Upper New York, much of Massachusetts, all of Rhode Island, kind of half of Connecticut, half of Virginia, almost all of North Carolina, about 60% of South Carolina, from a land point of view, are opposed. The blues in favor. So the votes are largely very close. They almost don't make it. The Federalists write the Federalist Papers. And ultimately, though, what they're sending out to be voted on is a new style of government. They're saying we want to present a new identity of this thing we call the United States. It's going to be this supreme entity. Everything else is subordinate, and it's really the beginning of that idea that the state is merely a small part of the larger whole. Now, let me just real quick run through then what are some of the thoughts about how this new government is perceived. So one of the best to observe is what Adams and Jefferson think. So they get copies of it, right? And so in the process of getting copies, they're trying to talk their way through it with each other. So he's in London, Jefferson's in Paris, so they're writing letters because it's much quicker to get communication with themselves. There are other Americans who come over and bring stuff, and so they both were given a copy. And Adams reads it, he's like, I like it, except there's no Bill of Rights. Because when he wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, the very first thing in the Massachusetts Constitution was an official Bill of Rights. He's thinking about the British Bill of Rights, which is not really a constitutional thing. A better way to say it is what we call a Bill of Rights is not a Bill of Rights. It's 8 amendments. We just like to call it that. But the English have a Bill of Rights. And so he wanted that in the document. And he writes that to Jefferson going, hey, we should have that. And then Jefferson writes to Madison, and he's like, I like it, but why isn't there a Bill of Rights? But he was most upset about the idea of a president. He's like, I can't believe you guys are actually considering having an executive. And for Jefferson, the part that made him scared was, A, I know Washington will be the first one, and B, the executive is in charge of the military force of the Union. Meaning, if he doesn't want to leave, he could just choose to stay. And if you read Washington's letters and writings and things in his 8 years of office, or 7.5, you see him admitting that. He knows that, and he's constantly trying to say, hey, I'm out, I'm not going to do that, I've laid my sword down, blah, blah, blah. But Jefferson's afraid. And then you can see the very famous statement between Adams and Jefferson, because Adams wanted the executive, and he wanted the executive to be stronger. I don't think Adams would like how we perceive the strength of the executive today, but he'd certainly be far happier than Jefferson with the strength of the executive. And when I say today, I mean, say, just in the 21st century, or really since World War II. And so, because he wanted a stronger executive, because Adams was afraid of the rich elite. So back to his idea, the rich elite should be given a house and then they can't leave. And you need a president who's got the power of the government to be able to oppose the rich elite. And Jefferson, who was one of the rich elite, was like, no, it's a terrible idea. And so I'll be afraid of the monarchy. So in the end, they both send letters of support. Adams kind of echoes what Jefferson said. Hey, look, it's not perfect, but I mean, it's okay. We'll get there. And Adams sort of hedging. I mean, Jefferson is like foreshadowing. We'll get there once we amend it. We'll amend it. We'll find a way to amend it. But they're both kind of on board in the process. We've kind of already seen this, but just to kind of loop back around into my hypothesis or my discussion, well, what do they do about religion? One of the most interesting things is that they don't seem to talk about it at all, which is not to say that in the room in Philadelphia they weren't Christian. or they weren't of some religious faith. They were, but they just didn't think it was necessary to talk about. I think part of that is because they believed it was to be handled at the state level, and they could leave it at the state level. Even as many of them are following Madison into a more Hobbesian setting, in the initial stages of the government, they still are not hardcore like we are today, where the federal government just does everything. So, and you see that by how Madison immediately goes to war with Hamilton, because Hamilton leans into it. He's like, yeah, let's get a bank. Let's bring the money here. And you know that story, particularly if you've seen the play, right? But Madison's like, whoa, no, I didn't say any of that, which technically he did. But nonetheless, he's pushing back really quickly. Then Jefferson goes with him. And so you have that first political party, the Republicans. Jefferson's Republicans set up on that premise of, we want to oppose that. So, but they don't really talk about it. There are people on both sides of the religious issue who are afraid then. So there's some who are like, look, we need to, moral virtue foundation, we need to make sure we've got good people in there. And how do you do that? You do it with some sort of test and to the oath, basically. And again, that was rejected by them. So they wanted that. Some at least wanted to have educational support like they had just passed for the Northwest Territory ordinances. But there are others who are like, no, we need to be clearly against this. In particular, Baptist pastors who were in Virginia, where at the time the dominant religion was still the Anglican faith. So they were in the minority. And so the last thing they wanted to see was any kind of consolidation of any one religious group. So they're pushing back. And in fact, they almost cost Madison the first election for the representative from Virginia to the Congress, because he was saying, we don't need to make this amendments that you all are asking for. And Monroe, who ran against him, was saying, yeah, we do need these amendments to try to make things better. And one of the groups that Madison has to switch on in order to try to get their support are Baptist leaders to say, okay, I hear you, I'll support you, I'll kind of go with you in the process. Which takes me back to the oath just for a second. Because one of the things I'm trying to say to people in the country today is, and it's Carl's hearing, so you may not agree with this, is that, as I've said in one of the earlier slides, there is a division over how much Christianity, or if any Christianity, or we might use the word religion versus Christianity. They would have said Christianity, but that's okay. And so when you get to the oath of office that he takes in his inaugural, there's a debate about whether George Washington said, so help me God, or not. Since FDR, every president has said, so help me God. Before FDR, only a few people said. But the story goes that right as they got ready to do, they're in New York City, as they got ready to do the oath, there's no Bible. This is unsurmountable. This is fact. They needed a Bible. Well, you and I can look at the Constitution and go, they don't need a Bible. And if I happen to be in the camp that says there should be nothing to do with religion at all, I got a problem, because everybody around was like, we need a Bible to take the oath. Right? So there's just that thing for you to wrestle with, however you want to say it, right? So they went and got one from the nearby Masonic Lodge, who had a big Bible on a stand, and they said, we can get that one, it's only a block away, so they went and got it. They opened it to this specific place. Whether it's specific or not is part of the historical debate that historians go to. Some would say it is specific, but regardless of that. And so they said it. We know for sure he did not say, so help me God, in 1792. There's records about what he said, and he didn't say it then. So we're like, did he say this or not say this? So it's been a debate, and it's become more of a debate in the latter 20th century. Perhaps some of you go, not surprisingly. And so in the latter 20th century, we know Taft, Harding, Coolidge, and FDR did say it. We know Chester Arthur is the first person for certain that has said, but there's some contemporary reports that said Lincoln said it. We don't have any other reports about any of the other presidents, including the founding presidents. You think of the founding presidents being from Washington to John Quincy Adams. So you look at theirs, like, we don't have any evidence that they said, so help me God, in the story. And again, it's not in the Constitution. What's interesting is, you can see people make this argument on the first part here, is that, well, clearly that's not what Congress wanted, so help me God. And you know that because in April, they had a bill passed in the House, just for the House, in which they had an oath, and some members were saying, so help me God, and they passed a bill saying, you can't say, so help me God. We're not having that religious stuff in here. Okay, cool. Same House, a few months later, passes the Judiciary Act and say, we need an oath. for the judges and the clerks, and they intentionally insert "So help me God," and you can Google it and read the Judiciary Act of 1789, and it's clearly there for both this, we would say, the administrative assistants, and not just the justices, but the people working for the justices. They all have to swear allegiance to the Constitution. Groovy, so does everybody else, but they have to say, "So help me God," at least in 1789. So we're kind of like, well, which is it, House leaders? Madison was there for both of those things. Do you want God in, want God out? How are we doing? And that gets to my argument that they're trying to walk this very narrow tightrope in which they are honoring the Enlightenment thought processes that they believed in, and for many of them, their idea of the Christian God, or at least the deist God, which they believed in. And you see that when you look at some of the other things that happened in this time period. The funniest one to me is when they decided to do a seal. And this is 76. So you've got Franklin, who most of you would know is a deist and maybe not a Christian, which is fine. And Jefferson, who often gets castigated as not a Christian, which is probably not fair. Probably not fair to say who is and who isn't a Christian anyway. But Adams, who is known as the most religious, and look what they wanted. Adams is like, "I want Hercules." And Franklin's like, "No, give me Moses." You're like, "Wait, what?" Well, that doesn't make any sense. You know, we didn't do any of that stuff, although I don't remember. But that's what they were looking for. And then, back to the inaugural, we do have all the inaugural speeches. And so in all of the inaugural speeches, now Washington's second, which is the shortest on record, and Jefferson's second, they didn't do this, but in the Jefferson's first, and Madison's, and Monroe's, and John Quincy Adams, obviously Washington, obviously John Adams, they all call for God's help. And sometimes they use code words, sometimes they don't, but it's very clear what they're saying. And so you and I, in trying to find a solution or about the recipe, I think that idea of them trying to find that balance is the correct thought process. Just food for thought as you're going. What's our final takeaways? So they move toward Hobbes. They are redefining what it means to be in the nation. They're trying to figure out the correct way to divide power. That battle will occur, and still to this very day, we're having it right now with our government, is how much power does the central government, and particularly the executive, actually have? They understood Congress to be the most dominant. They did honor the states some. This has all been taken away from the states. So if you hear state leaders that are pushing back, maybe they're pushing back because power has been taken from them. And whether it was intentional or not, that ambiguity was really, really important to them. And then, as I just finished saying, probably should have this slide next. In general terms, you can look and find for them that they understood the premise for the republic, which they're setting up, that there does need to be this moral virtue foundation, but at no point are they trying to either reject religious faith or spirituality or Christianity in specific, nor are they trying to, quote unquote, establish we will be a Christian nation. And that balancing act is one that I think is really important for us to take away. Thank you so much. So you had a question. I know, I'm with you. What's your question?
Thinking about the equating of Christian religion with moral peace,
Uh-huh.
it seems like you kind of ended there with it still in the debate. Has there been discussion over time about if you want a moral foundation whereby we do right by each other, does that only come from a Christian faith? Or are there, I mean, is that the...
So my answer for my podcast was that it does not only come from a Christian faith. We are not a nation peopled only with Christians anymore. So when they set it up, that's the way I say it in the podcast. That is, they were never a Christian nation, but it is accurate to say in that time period that they were a nation peopled mostly with Christians, like 80, 90%. We are not today. And if I was given the task of helping design a new one, it would be very broad. I have some wonderful friends of a variety of viewpoints, and I've had some of these conversations with them. In fact, if you listen to the 4th bonus episode with one of my close friends who is an atheist, who's a brilliant man, I think, and I asked him at the end, what are some ideas we could have included if he and I were getting to build it? And he shares his thoughts from a non-theistic, non-Christian, non-religious point of view. It's quite interesting to hear his take on that process. So I think, for myself, there is plenty of room for us to find some key things that could be a useful moral virtue foundation in 2025 for us. But we have to decide the bigger question. I think actually people will argue that's the question. Will you allow some other group or not allow a group? But I really feel like right now the bigger question is the first adjective, common, that we don't want to be in common anymore. but we'll see. I don't know, that's the thing. But yes, there wasn't discussed. And remember, after the Cold War, it became such a big deal in our battle with USSR, who we by calling them communists, and by their own admission, they were atheistic, right? So then our counter to that was "In God We Trust," which was already in the money, but then we added it to the pledge at that point, kind of a thing. So it kind of became this catchphrase, which I would suggest probably in hindsight was not the best idea, but that's what they did. But I think since then there's been continued conversations, but that's a good question. Yes, sir.
So elections were left to the states, I guess, ideally, in their discussions, but was there any more back and forth on that?
When you say elections, meaning for the national representatives? No, they were pretty much just, they had some target dates relative to like the inaugural was in I think April, and the November date was the solid date for at the national level, so they kind of used that as a place. But then beyond that, their idea was each state would kind of construct their own system. That changes when we get obviously to the 15th Amendment, really 14th, and then 14th leading to 15th, and then since then other amendments. We've had a little bit more prescription from Congress relative to voting.
So was it apples and oranges then on how they actually conducted it and so forth?
Most of the elections, if you mean like just the physical functional aspect, was there would be a room and you'd walk into it, you'd vote, you just drop your thing in. It was always in the open, it was never secret. It was always wide open, and you'd have it. Sometimes they would have like a week to get it done because people are coming from their farms and their other places to have it happen over time. But there'd just be a box that would be there, and people would line up and put their vote in. Which you obviously can see immediately how I at least would find that very problematic, because you have this idea of the sanctity of your vote that is in your own conscience and how you wish to vote. And if you want to tell people, you do, and if you don't want to tell people, you don't. But at that time, that was not an option. Yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned that you believe that we should still, like, you agree with the electoral college. I was kind of wondering what, if you don't mind, what do you think would be the challenges that we would face if we didn't have the electoral college?
So the question is, I've said that I believe in the electoral college. Make sure I get this right.
Yeah.
And then what would the questions be if we did not have the electoral college? Well, so I agree with Madison that democracies have always been spectacles of contention, and that they basically harm they harm the minority, and that they harm. His statement was I don't have these memorized. That they are negative to private property because the majority can take from you. We could just vote in here. Everybody wearing black needs to be stripped of their voting rights. So you and her out of luck. You have no recourse because in a democracy there's no judges to go to because the voting has happened. Right, so the people have spoken. Nobody wearing black, so nobody else is wearing black. Sorry, you're out of luck too. That kind of thing. And I know it's frivolous what I just said, but there's a sense in which I think there's real power in that. And I go, yeah, I don't want to be in that setting. The whole idea of a republic is that the majority is leashed or bound in order to protect the minority, whatever the minority might be. Right, but in a democracy, the majority is unleashed, and it's 50% plus one. The end. And so, I think people claim and want to have a democracy, it's scary. I think they miss the point. But then back specifically for the president to the electoral college, to your point, I think, to me, we've already seen what the dangers are. It's a popularity contest. You have this whole kind of, particularly in the past, say, 50 years since I have been a mass media, you no longer really get to hear the depths of what's being discussed. I mean, just go back, and the most famous one, obviously, is Lincoln Douglas. Go back and read. It's a big, huge, thick book of their debates where one guy spoke for an hour and a half, and then the guy followed him up with an hour, and then the guy followed him with 30 minutes. And then did that 9 or 7 times. A lot of people, you guys are wonderful. You're here for an hour and a half. There's a lot of people who would have left after 15 minutes. And so that's telling about our mental capacity to grasp and follow ideas. And so for at least the past 50 years, we end up with platitudes and bumper stickers and cutesy little phrases, but it doesn't tell me what the candidate actually really would do or really would think. And I want to know what she's thinking about in this situation, at this situation. And she needs to have maybe 30 minutes to extrapolate on that and kind of get her ideas out and really, really elaborate the position. And then he needs more time to attack the position or explain his own viewpoint. And just that whole idea of a popularity contest is a disaster. And I think we've basically proven it over the past, at least, well, now, the voting for the president began to change in 28 with Jackson. Was much more, it wasn't every state, but it was almost every state in 60 for when Lincoln happened. So we've been voting for the president directly in that regard
and that voting then to quote unquote guide the Electoral College. So it's not a recent thing. So I need to be more fair to our recent presidents. When I say recent, I'm really thinking FDR to now. So I'd be a critic of all of those elections. But mass media, starting with TV, has made it worse. And you see that starting with the 60 election. So I don't know if out there. Yes, sir.
So would the founding fathers see democracy and a republic on parallel tracks, or would one be a subset of the other?
No, parallel and two distinct choices. So they're not related at all. The only related is because they're both governments of the people, because they both are governments of the people. And you get that, we've had this conversation here before, you can find some of my lectures. And what the Athenians did was different and distinct from what the Romans did. And so that just fact that they're distinct tells me that they were, by the original designers, are seen as separate. And what's happened since the 20th century, it really starts probably late 19th century, is you have this blurring in the definition, even though there's no blurring in the execution. So we get confused about the definition, about the word I should use. You go back and look at the presidential speeches leading up to Wilson. Wilson's the one who really makes this change, in my opinion, to his detriment, or to his shame. I'm no fan of Wilson. And you read the speeches of governors and of elected officials and presidents, and they talk consistently about the republic. Since Woodrow Wilson, you have to hunt to find any president who talks about the republic, and they talk consistently about, capital D, the democracy. And I'm sorry, it's just not in our Constitution. You want to win a $20 bar bet? I've told you this joke before. Just bet somebody $20 which one we are, and they'll say they're a democracy. And so I've got $20 in the bar, and they go, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the, and pick the money up and walk away. I see you up there, but yes, somebody else's hand was up here. Yes, sir. So John Locke and Thomas Hobbes are the two great British philosophical thinkers that are coming out of the Renaissance as the ideas of Rome and Athens are being finally remembered and implemented. Venice has tried a version of a republic, Florence to some degree, some of the Swiss cantons are trying the idea, but those are very small, and so that had been tried on a larger level. And you've got thinkers in France and in England going in. Francis Bacon is another one that precedes these guys. But in the middle of the Civil War, Hobbes writes his writing, it's called Leviathan, in which he basically lays out his view of what will be the successful, correct government to create what he called the social contract. Every writer since, Rousseau, Locke, Montesquieu, when they reference social contract, they're taking it from Hobbes. And it always frustrates me because I kind of like Hobbes and like where he's going, that you can find people, I don't know where this thing's at, where you can find people who will act like the social contract concept is Rousseau's, because he writes a book called Social Contract, but it's Hobbes. It's Hobbes' idea. So if the people are going to be in a collective entity together, so all of us are going to go on a rocket ship to Mars. We're going to live there. We're never coming back. I'll let you bring 3 friends. I don't know about you, but before I get on the rocket with me and my family and my 3 friends, I want to know what the rules are going to be. And so I ain't going until I can agree with you and everybody in here what we doing and how we doing it. So we're going to sit right here in this room, and if it takes us 6 months, it takes us 6 months. But I'm not getting on the rocket until we've agreed to it. That would be me saying I want a social contract with all of you, who most of you I only barely know, before we go live the rest of our lives in another place.
Or in an HOA.
And so that idea of a social contract is what Hobbes is arguing. And the simplest way to say it is think of it on a continuum, right? From 0 to 10. So for Hobbes, and the continuum is about power, right? There's a lot of other things that Hobbes and Locke write, and you can discuss a lot of different pieces, but at the simplest level, it's where should the governing power over the social contract lie? And for Hobbes, it should be mostly, if not all, with the central government, the Leviathan, the creature from the Bible who's like this giant, overawing, scary thing that comes out of the ground. Think of the movies where Godzilla pops out of the water and everybody runs for their life. Why do they run? Well, they're afraid. They're in awe. So if we have the Leviathan who has all the power, then the citizens will not break any of the rules. And that's because the citizens are self-focused. They're most naturally going to do what's in their best interest. which will lead to conflict, or what Hobbes calls war. But when you read war in Hobbes, people think of national wars and they lose what he's saying. Just think about your middle school days with the guy you didn't like. That's what he's talking about. Locke, on the other side, though, says, no, because the human is good, central power should be extraordinarily limited. Both were fine with the monarchy. Both were fine with an elected legislature. Everybody likes to accuse Hobbes of being monarchist, but Locke's the one that signed on with William and Mary. So it's not about the type of government, it's about the amount of power. So the Articles of Confederation are designed to have limited power in the central government, which is a Lockean document. Meanwhile, this Constitution is designed to have more power in the central government, which is Hobbesian. One more question, this young lady here.
Oh, no, you just answered it, because I hear people say all the time that, we live in a democracy, and I correct them, and I say, no, this is a republic, like Benjamin Franklin said, and people look at me like I'm insane, like, why would you say that? And I tell them, don't read history.
Go read the Constitution. It's right there in the Constitution. And it's a very important distinction. So I'll leave you with this. I won't even use the recent election. You guys remember the turmoil after the 2000 election? Why? Because candidate Gore got more votes. And if you've been taught we're a democracy, that's the end of the story. And so he got screwed if I live in a democracy. But if I know, actually, I live in a republic, which is a different style of government of the people, and it's got a different set of structural rules, then regardless of whether it's an electoral college thing, I know I can't lean on singularly how many votes. You see this in some of the decisions that they've made in the House and the Senate, because we have several things we vote on that are not 50% plus one. Why would they do that? They do that because we're not in a democracy. And because people have been, I'll just use a harsh word, because they've been lied to for reasons that are more philosophical and emotional. And again, go back, what did Wilson say? We're going to be an arsenal of democracy. Well, I love the sentiment, Woodrow, but you're wrong in the now. But because you say that kind of stuff and it sounds like you're being more virtuous by being in a democracy, and they've been taught this lie, when they saw the vote total for Mr. Gore and Mr. Bush, they were outraged. But had they been taught properly that we live in a republic, they might have been very disappointed, but they would have said, well, that vote has nothing to do with it. And they would have said, what is the deciding factor about how we choose the president, and go on from there. I am so excited you guys had all these questions. I would love to, if you want to ask me any questions, you can reach me here, and then I hope that you will come back to any of our talks. As you can see, once in January, we're going to hit our focus on the USA 250 celebration. Bring your friends, bring your kids. I'd love to see you. Have a great rest of your Saturday.